Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do another crucial point. This is a video in my series on the King James Bible, and this is something where I've done a lot of research over the last few days to discover where we are with the revisions of the King James Bible. Now, I have a facsimile of an original King James Bible here. You can see that it's absolutely beautiful, and you've got the full text of the King James Bible. When I bring it really close, you can see the words. A lot of people will say, well, I stick to the King James Bible. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I actually like the King James Bible, not this particular version, of course, because this particular version would be exceptionally difficult to read in English. But it is a copy, and it's very, very interesting to see it. Of course, this particular version is only a facsimile of the Bible itself. The King James Version included the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was something like about an extra third again, and that was also included in the King James Bible, and was so for quite a number of hundreds of years. It's only when the missionary movement began and it was discovered that Bibles were very expensive to produce, and so people started to omit the Apocrypha, not because they didn't like it, although some didn't. They did it purely for financial reasons. It was much cheaper to produce the King James Version without the Apocrypha. So the question I'm asking today is this little pocket version of the New Testament, it's the New Testament and Psalms. I've had this for many, many years. I carry it in my top pocket. Is this the King James Version that we understand today? When you look at the front, you just find that it just says the Authorized Version. It doesn't give any details about what edition of the Authorized Version it is. Another example is this one. This is my Faithful Companion Bible, produced by Kriegel Publications. It's absolutely beautiful. It's my first go-to Bible whenever I'm studying. And right at the very beginning, it just says that this is, I'll just find the page for you. It says that this is the Authorized Version of 1611. That's what it says at the very beginning, the Authorized Version of the 1611. The thing is, of course, it's not that. This particular companion Bible was produced first in 1922, and it doesn't tell us any details about which edition of the King James Bible it is. What we do know is that it's the King James Bible, but in a revised form. It probably is the 1769 revision, but we're not sure. It doesn't say so. What we know about this particular King James Version is that it has certain revisions which are unique to itself, not copied in any other edition. I mean, the Psalms is completely reset, and in particular the subscriptions and the superscriptions in the Psalms are correctly put in place, which renders all other editions of the King James Version incorrect. So when you go to this particular pocket version, and it says, actually at the top of the page, it doesn't have any indication on any of the Psalms, any of the titles. The titles and the superscriptions and the subscriptions are actually part of the Bible, but in this particular version, they're omitted. They're omitted to make it cheap to produce, and they're omitted to make it simple. Also, in this particular New Testament copy of the King James Version, there is no indication anywhere about any omissions or any texts that need to be omitted or included. There's no references whatsoever. It's just the text of the King James Version. Now I have another King James Version here. This is the Nestle-Aland Greek Interlinear, but alongside it is the King James Version. Now we know that this particular King James Version, as far as I'm able to know, it just says the marginal text of the authorized King James Version, but it doesn't tell you which particular edition of the King James Version or which particular revision. Doesn't tell you at all, which again is a failing in the translation. This is my own personal Bible. It was created many years ago. What's that say? Oh, the wrong way up. Let's say it says the Daily Devotional Bible. It's my own personal Bible. It has all of my notes for the introduction to all the books of the Bible. It's also laid out in such a format that actually you can use it on a diary basis. You can turn to the date and it will give you the reading for the day. The interesting thing is that there's no note in here as to which edition of the King James Bible that we have. We don't know. We presume it's the 1769 edition, but of course we don't know at all. So this is my own personal copy. So then, amongst all these different King James versions, they're all King James versions, but amongst them all there's differences in the text, differences in the translation. In fact, it becomes an exceptionally difficult thing to work out which of the King James versions that you're actually holding. Now, in 2011, the Cambridge University Press was evidently printing at the same time 5 different editions of the King James Version. And some people may say, yeah, but they're all the King James Version. No, you don't understand. These revisions were very different and fundamentally different. The whole point about a revision is that they revise the text in such a way to improve it or to make it what they consider to be better. So the 5 editions were the Concord King James Version, the Pitminian King James Version, the Standard King James Version or the Emerald Edition, the Transetto King James Version edition, and the 2011 King James edition of the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible, edited by David Norton. Now you may say, edited? How could a man edit the Bible? Well, he's editing the notes, of course, but he's also editing very often the text. So these 5 present editions also differ from many earlier Cambridge editions, such as. Now let's go through them one by one, because this is quite an eye-opener. In 1629, there was brought out a King James Version. This was only 18 years. Was it 18 years? Yes, 18 years after 1611. This copy of the King James Bible, a large quarto edition, was the first Cambridge, England printing of the King James Version. It was the first printing since the first edition of 1611, in which editors included a number of revisions, chiefly incorporating more literal readings of the text originally presented in the marginal notes. So the marginal notes now are then being introduced into the text. It's one thing to have a note in the margin saying, well, this actually could be better translated as. It's quite another thing to take their suggestion and put it into the text. So the 1629 King James edition was fundamentally different, very different. There were a very, very large number of changes. As well as the editors attempted to restore the proper text, which had been affected by many misprints in previous printings. Now, there have been lots of previous printings. 2 who participated in the Cambridge printing, Dr. Samuel Ward and John Boyce, worked on the original translation of the King James Version. So this is the King James translators revising their own edition of the King James Version. Okay. Now you say, well, is that it? No. In 1631, another King James Version came out, which was called by the population the Wicked Bible, because it said Unfortunately, it says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." Now, 7 years later, 1638, another edition came out with many changes. In 1755, John Wesley did his own revision of the New Testament. So it was still the King James Version, but he revised it and improved it, as he would say, in many, many places. In 1743, another King James edition came out. In 1762, another came out from Cambridge by Francis Sawyer Parris. He was involved in the original 1611 version. And then in the following year, 1763, another edition came out, produced by John Baskerville. This is just six of them. Of course, in the very early days, there were a number of editions which had so many printers' errors and so many mistakes that they were fined quite heavily, and a new edition had to be produced. So in 1764, we have another edition, which was a revision by Anthony Purver. 1769, we have another edition. They called it the Standard Text. The Standard Text, as if there was no other. This was produced by Benjamin Blaney in Oxford. A few years later, 1791, a new King James Version came out called produced by Gilbert Wakefield. And in 1808, a new edition came out, Charles Thomson's Revision, it was called. In 1817, a new edition came out again. Sometimes between these two dates is only a matter of either a few years or 10 years or whatever. But there were lots of editions that came out, and each one was different to the previous, obviously. I mean, you're not going to edit something and then bring out a new edition, then find that it's the same. The whole point is that it's edited. Then in 1826, we have Alexander Campbell, who brings out his revision of the King James Version. So all of these Bibles were King James Version, no question about that, but they were revisions of the King James Version. And we could ask already, we've now got 11 versions. The question is, which one is the perfect Word of God? And the answer, of course, none of them is. None of them are the perfect Word of God. The only thing that was ever perfect was the original manuscripts that the apostles wrote. They were the ones that were inspired, and all these are translations. So then we have another one in 1833, the Noah Webster revision. Now, Noah Webster was an American, and he employed his children to read through and to check the manuscript. He gave them £5 if they could find a mistake. And so this became one of the most faultless versions of the King James Version. In 1863, we have Robert Young, who sets out to produce the King James Version, but in a literal form. It is a literal version of the King James Version. Okay, and it's quite different to the normal King James Version, but they're all King James Versions. They're all revisions. Now, in 1873, we have what's called the Paragraph Bible. Okay, now this was produced by H.F.A. Scrivener. Okay. In 1876, 3 years later, Julia E. Smith Parker brings out a revision of the King James Version. And then in 1855, after many, many years of work, we have the English Revised Version. This was something that was produced by a convocation of Canterbury. They recognized that the 1611 King James Version needed to be revised very, very seriously. So they brought out a completely new, the English Revised Version. If I had to go to a version of the Bible, if I wanted to use the King James Version, but I wanted to use a version that was very, very accurate, then I would go to the English Revised Version. In fact, there are many, many Bibles that are produced which have the King James Version on the one side, and which is the 1769, and then they have the English Revised Version on the right-hand side, and you can compare the two. And when you look at the English Revised Version and you look at the Greek, you'll discover that it is exceptionally accurate. However, it doesn't read so well. The reason why it doesn't read so well is because of the order of the Greek words in the original manuscripts. So far we have 16 different King James versions. We've got to ask ourselves, which one is the King James Version? And the answer is they're all the King James Version, but they're all different. And they're all radically different. Then in 1890, J.N. Darby brings out his own revision of the King James Version. In 1896, six years later, there is the Parallel Revised Edition. They're all different, you see. And then in 1901, we have the American Standard Version revision of the King James Bible. Now, this is the favored revision in America. It's the one that people like best. The 1901 American Standard Version. But don't let that name confuse you. Yes, it is American, it's standard, and it's a version, but it's the King James Version revised. Right, so then in 1922, we mentioned it earlier, we have the Companion Bible. So the Companion Bible, as I said earlier, the publishers say this is the 1611 King James Version. Of course, it isn't at all. If you look at the 1611 and you look at the Companion Bible and you put them side by side, you find that they're absolutely and very different. Exceptionally different. Okay, right. For example, in the Companion Bible, there are very significant differences in the Psalms. That's the important thing there. So far, we're on 21 editions or versions of the King James Bible. Now, in 1946, we have a new edition of the King James Bible, but they give it a new name. They call it the New English Bible. Okay, the New English Bible. But it's a revision of the King James Bible. In 1950, the Jehovah's Witnesses take the King James Bible and they revise it, not in a good way, but they revise it to support their own peculiar views. They call it the New World Translation, but it's just the New Testament, and it is a revision of the King James Bible. You can't believe how many different revisions there are. Then in 1952, we have a revised standard version. So the previous revised standard version is now revised. Okay, so it's a revision of the King James Bible. In 1960, we have the King James Version Children's Edition, produced by J.P. Green, and she did a great job revising the King James Version specifically for children. And then in 1960, the following year, the Jehovah's Witnesses bring out their revision of the whole of the King James Bible. Of course, it's not a good version, it's not a good revision, and of course most scholars wouldn't accept it as being a Bible. However, it is a revision of the King James Bible. This time it's the whole Bible, not just the New Testament. In 1971, we have J.P. Green again. She brings out the King James Version number 2. So this is the second revision of the King James Bible. In 1971, so same year, we have the New American Standard Bible, the NASB. Now guess what that is? This is a revision of the American Standard Bible, which is a revision of the King James Bible. So it's a King James Bible version. That's what that is. Now, then the same year, there also came a revised standard version, which was a revision of the ASB in 1901. So the revised standard version. Now, the Revised Standard Version, it looks different. The name is different. But beneath the name, it's a King James Version. It's just revised, that's all. And at the beginning, they explain why they're revising. They're explaining that there's at least 7 words that have completely switched meaning to the opposite to what they meant. And there are many words that are archaic. They're just not used anymore. Nobody uses the words in plain speech anymore. So they explain what their revision is all about. Now in 1982, we have the new King James Version. So this is a revision, okay, of the King James Version. It's another edition. Then we have, in 1985, the King James Version number 3, produced by J.P. Green. She's done a tremendous job, very, very good job in revising the King James Version. Also in the same year, 1985, we have a King James Version which was brought out to deal with the problems of previous versions. Very often it's to do with capitalization. Sometimes the word spirit loses its capital S and has a small s. And sometimes that's incorrect. Not always, but sometimes that's incorrect. And so a new version was brought out in 1985 to be a revision of the King James Version. Okay? This, by the way, is revision number 31. 31 revisions so far. Now in 1989, 4 years later, we have a new revised version. A new revised version of the King James Bible, the NRSV. Then in 1994, we have the New Century Edition. You say, what's that? Well, it's the King James Version, but revised. You say, how many more revisions can there be? Oh, there's a lot more yet. So that's the New Century Version. Then we have the, in 1995, that was 1994, by the way, the New Century. In 1995, we have the New American Standard Bible, NASB. And I guess what this is? This is a revision of the American Standard Bible, which is a revision of the King James Version. So it is actually a revision of the King James Bible. In 1998, we have the Third Millennium Bible. Guess what this is? It's a revision of the King James Bible. Now, all of these Bibles are completely unique. The wording is unique in them. Sometimes it's very close, but the differences are there. And the reason why they're unique is because they don't break the copyright of any of the previous versions. Okay. Now, in 1999, we have the modern King James Version. In 1999, we also have the American King James Version. In 2000, you're going to like this, we have the updated King James Version. A year later, we have the easy reading King James Version. 2 years later, we have the comfortable King James Version. And in 2005, we have a new Cambridge Study Bible produced by David Norton, and it's a revision of the King James Bible. You say, good gracious me. Right. So in 2006, we have 3 versions of the King James Bible. We have the AV7, which is called the New Authorized Version. We have the KJV Authorized Version Update, not the updated King James Version. No, it's the King James Version Update. And also that year we have the King James Version Corrected Edition. So they've corrected all of the errors of a previous King James Version. That's astounding, isn't it? We then have, in 2008, the Mickelson Clarified translation. But what is it? Well, it's a King James Version clarified. Okay. In 2011, we have the Divine Name King James Version. So this is a King James Version in which God's name is is recorded correctly. Many of the previous, most, in fact, maybe all of the previous translations have not got God's name properly designated. So now it is. It's properly designated. The divine name, King James Version. Now in 2013, we have the New World Revision. The New World Revision. So what's that? Well, it's the King James Bible, the whole Bible, revised and updated. Of course, some of the revisions and some of the suggestions of translation are not compatible with Christian teaching. But that's not the point. The point is it's a King James Bible, but it's revised. It's produced by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, some scholars reckon it to be exceptionally accurate, but it has many quirks about it that are slanted towards their particular heresy or their particular point of view. But we mustn't look badly upon that, because the original 1611 King James Bible also had a slant to its own political and religious point of view. Now in 2014, so 1 year later, we have the Modern English Version. Modern English Version, that sounds good, doesn't it? It's just a King James Version revised. In 2020, everybody goes mad, absolutely mad. We have the King James Version for Catholics. We have the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, which is a revision of the King James Version in the beginning. It's a revision of the American Standard Bible, but it's the New American Standard Bible. Now there's also, so far, we've got 50 editions of the King James Version. So when somebody says, well, I stick to the King James Version, the 1611, well, first of all, you don't. You don't stick to this. You're talking as if you do, but you actually don't. The 1611 version, that's not what you're using. You probably are using the 1769 version. That's what this is, as far as we can tell. But the important thing is this, is that the Gideons, you know who the Gideons are. These are people, good Christian people, who put Bibles into hospitals and into hotels all over the world in millions of copies. But their edition, you may not realize, in the original days, by the way, was a King James Version. But it was a King James Version produced specially for them, because they had certain verses and certain concepts that they wanted to keep that weren't in the new King James versions. So they had a new edition of the King James Version published with special permission for their preferred translation of certain texts. So that's another edition. So that's 51 editions so far. Now, what we haven't been able to ascertain, and we might be able to get this information, is that the King James Version very often was translated from the King James Version into the native languages of the countries where missionaries were working. Now we know, for example, in Kenya that there's the Lu Bible, and the Lu Bible is a King James Version translated into the Lu language. So is it a King James Version? Yes, it's an edition or a version of the King James. So therefore it's a King James Version. So that now makes it 52. But of those 52, it may be 20 or 30 or 40 translations of the King James Version into native languages. We don't know how many. Also in 2020, we have the New World Translation, which is now in 5 editions, all of them different. It's still a King James Version, but tampered with and changed, not everywhere, but in part. It's changed just in part to support the false teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. But it's still a King James Version, of course. But notice this. It is now, by 2020, these 5 versions that they've got are retranslated into over 200 languages. So that's 1,000 versions of the King James Version. And we don't know how many individual Bibles are produced, but it's a very, very, very large number. So when you pick up a King James Version, you've got to ask yourself, if this is the perfect Word of God, in the sense it's absolutely without error, you've got to ask yourself, which edition is it? Which one is it? Because as we've been able to show, there are at least 53 versions or editions of the King James Bible, all of which are different. Some of them very radically and some of them very little. The question we've got to ask ourselves is, which is the King James Version? And the answer is, that is not easy to say. But to say that the King James Version is God's final translation to the world today is just false. It can't be true. It cannot be true. Well, we leave all this with you to think about. Next time we come on here to talk about the King James Version, we're going to be talking about the preface to the King James Version, and also the preface to the Revised Standard Version and the New International Version, because all 3 of them are very pertinent in the story of the King James Version. So we look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. Have a great day, and bye for now.